This is the Bible Touchstone. Here we're dealing with the question of whether a full preterist could rightfully regard themselves as Reformed, whether full preterism can reconcile with Reformed theology as a systematic theology. Now, some full preterists have tried to justify themselves and identify themselves, perhaps to get some more legitimacy for their position, with the Reformed tradition. And they'll suggest, by identifying or outlining a very loose and abstract definition for the five solas, and they'll say that they adhere to the five solas of the Reformation, or they may hold to semper reformanda, and some will even suggest that they are 5-point Calvinists, so that even though their eschatology may be somewhat heterodox, their soteriology is distinctly Reformed. And some will even point out that the Reformed tradition, for example, Calvin never wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation, and some general disagreements between very particular doctrines that do not affect practice and life and church government and all those things, that do not affect those kind of church order, and then suggest because there was no general agreement on these very loose and abstract ideas that the Reformed tradition isn't developed in its eschatology, although of course there are very marked distinctives and marked agreements concerning the resurrection of the dead, the judgment, and the second coming. But some will suggest that their soteriology is it's distinct from their eschatology. These are marked and distinct compartments that don't affect one another. And where it does affect one another, for example, covenant themes, they may be in some agreement, which I agree with. But one's soteriology and one's eschatology, in fact, all of one's system is so interconnected with one's eschatology that we cannot just divorce it and isolate them as separate compartments so arbitrarily. Basically, some full preterists are suggesting that those who are Reformed that are claiming that full preterists are not Reformed have a very strict and obstinate definition of what it means to be Reformed. It's very specific. And that's exactly why we do have the confessions and describing, who holds a more covenantal position, who has a more Baptist distinctive, and those kind of things. And some full preterists will point that out, that not all the confessions that come from the Reformed tradition are in general agreement, at least for some particular issues, such as over baptism and that kind of thing. But again, that's not the question at hand here. The question at hand here is, what is a subscription to a confession, whereas a full preterist doesn't have the same idea of what a subscription to a confession is as a subscriptionist would. So again, some full preterists may even claim that the only dispute here is controversy over timing and nature of the resurrection, or the timing and nature of the judgment and second coming. But it's not just a dispute or controversy over the timing and nature of when these things will take place, because it affects one's whole view of the biblical system and how it's formulated and presented. For example, some full preterists, and I myself was included, believed that the full preterist position agreed very much with the orthodox position concerning the chronology and the sequence. In fact, full preterism is so big on chronology and sequence and timing that that's probably its strongest point. But that's not all we're talking about when we talk about order. We're also talking about logic and those kind of things. It's not always about timing in the temporal and material sense, or the materialist dialectic sense. What we're talking about is things are logically consequent from God's sovereign decrees and orders, and how they're realized in nature, in creation, here on earth. What happens in heaven happens on earth. And there is a timing issue here, because everything that happens by God's decree and His intervention and His providence are always definitive and concrete and realist acts that we realize here on earth. So, but the issue here that I wanted to hit on most is that full preterism cannot be reformed because it departs not just on eschatological themes concerning the timing and nature of some of the major events that everybody seems to agree upon, for example, the resurrection, the judgment, and the second coming, and judgments, national judgments, and so forth on Israel. But full preterist, its whole paradigm as a system, and it is a consistent system, but it departs on some of the very more elementary principles of Christian orthodoxy. And namely, those is that it departs from a view of the curse, the fall of man, one's view of mankind, that is, their makeup and their depravity. In full-preterism, one's only partially depraved, not totally depraved. Or they may not even see that the physical body is part of one's whole makeup. Whereas even the Lord has even purchased and bought our bodies because they are part of who we are. The full-preterist has some dualist problems here, where how does the soul actually move the body and so forth? How does the spirit move the body? Some of these questions from their philosophical paradigm are not answered in a satisfactory way that would, satisfy most theologians and philosophers. Also, one's view of the incarnation. It's different in full-preterism because the mission and the definitive work of Christ is not to eradicate sin, but it does deal with it very particularly in some instances, but after the application is definitively accomplished in the past, there is still evidence of the stain of sin here in the earth. Also, one's view of sanctification is totally different, and the Christian regenerate does not have the duty to mortify the deeds of the body, or at least they may, but they're not accountable to those sins anymore because they're definitively sanctified, but there is no progressive sanctification in full-preterism. So it does affect one's belief and practice for how they live their lives today. The view of the penal substitutionary atonement, the definitions that we have in the Reformed tradition are markedly different in full-preterism. Also, the necessity of the atonement, which goes along with the incarnation. Some of these doctrines that are articulated and formulated in the Reformed tradition are not described the same way in full-preterism. So some of the full-preterist views are not just different and heterodox, but they are very dangerous in their leniences and proclivities. So the definitive work of Christ is very much altered in full-preterism, and it's different from the Reformed tradition, which alters one's view of all the doctrinal heads that we call Calvinism or five-point Calvinism, because they're all connected. So also one's view of limited atonement and a definite elect who are ransomed by the Lord, that is significantly different when we talk about the definitive work of Christ. In full-preterism, some full-preterists have suggested that the limited atonement doesn't have to be a definite number. Well, that's the nature of the doctrine and the definitive word of Christ, how we look at the atonement and the penal substitution of our Lord Jesus Christ in the Reformed tradition. As always, grace be to you.